Ushla agus a cordja. Bawad fáilte chu roimh go dtí an séo féileann na bhláirte. Bawad buchas a gháil le tras a seoige agus a fear chéile a chuireann an seomra álannseo fáildúin, blian in níos blian. Tá anahas orm go bhfuil sibse a hagan go rialta chuig an éile agus muintear áin na hagan takeíocht dún, gach blian eáil anseo. Sibse atá anseo an céadúir tásúla gom go muidir stolt agus tanamh as. Bawad fáilte bhuiile a chuir ribh an íspéisialta atá gwen, óachtar an iireachtais, marín bhéine nó marín ícaníile as inis man. An trasna armadan ó inis man. So fáilte rud a marín. Bhil an fáilte chuir ribh Lovejoy atá chun leirlinn faoi uairscéalta í leatharta Mr. Gilhooly and the Puritan. I would like to welcome the Cathaoirleach of Common Liam agus Tomás í leatharta, Joseph O'Coig, and members of our committee, Sheila Caton and Emily Cullen. Agus na mná fiantracha, Barbara í Caníla agus Áine í leatharta, a cowrie gomórlan im líana. Bhil buchas go bháil le mórín bhicloplan nach féidir le bhé anseo agus le mórí bhála atá ag golabhú on American Wake going into exile Branona. Now, for the last few years, our society has attempted to revive interest in the writings of Liam O'Flaherty and Tom O'Flaherty. The seed of Liam's writings was planted by his mother. In his book, Shame the Devil, Liam O'Flaherty writes beautifully about this. How gay she was, and in spite of all her suffering, he writes, even when there was no food in the house, she would gather us about her at the Empty Heart and weave fantastic stories about giants and fairies, or mime the comic adventures of our neighbours, until our hungry little bellies were sick with laughter. That's a beautiful description. She would weep over the beauty of a little flower growing from a speck of dirt on a naked rock, as well as for her own sufferings. A. Kelly, who edited many of the works of Liam O'Flaherty, quotes in her introduction to O'Flaherty's short stories, and I think it really captures the wonderful artist and the wonderful man that O'Flaherty was. O'Flaherty once said, there are some writers whom one immediately recognises, bookish fellows, whose drawing room civilization obtrudes unpleasantly on the senses. They are just writers, no matter how great. But there are others who are great men, because they are men, and who write because chance turns their energies towards writing as a means of creation. These are the men I love, O'Flaherty says. Out of their speech, out of their eyes, out of the movements of their bodies, joyousness and exuberance flow, and they make you feel it is good to be alive. A. Kelly reminds us this passage might well have been written about O'Flaherty himself. We are delighted we have two young scholars making a contribution to this year's Féile, Laura Lovejoy and Siofra Aiken. Laura graduated with a BA and an MA and PhD in University College Dublin before she migrated south to University College Cork, where she holds an Irish Research Council postdoctorate fellowship in the School of English. And in September she goes to New York University as a Fulbright scholar. Laura is going to talk about the shifting moral landscape which informed the 1920s and 1930s novels of Liam O'Flaherty. She will look at O'Flaherty's novels Mr. Gilhooly and The Puritan. And she'll look at these as critiques of prominent social reform activities which the Irish Free State launched at the time. She will look especially at the hypocrisy underpinning the conservative sexual politics of the period. Please welcome Laura Lovejoy.
Dír díomh is me se Laura agus tá anna átharm bheith leabhart anseo inniu. Thank you all very much for coming, and thank you so much to Kathleen and Pat and the committee for having me here. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk about some of my favourite Liam O'Flaherty novels and why I think his social consciousness is so radical for its time, and hopefully I can do him justice. Liam O'Flaherty's novels of the 1920s and 1930s reveal a persistent dissatisfaction with the new political regime in Ireland, conveying a sense of disappointment at the broken utopian promises of 1916 and an ineffectual government, which he was not alone in viewing as a poor alternative to the colonial authority it replaced. The prostitute, a highly charged and subversive figure in the Irish popular imagination at this time, became a fixture of O'Flaherty's articulation of dissent against what he saw as the increasingly reactionary direction of mainstream nationalism in Ireland. In his 1931 book, I Went to Russia, O'Flaherty wrote that the Irish, far from being revolutionary, were among the most reactionary nations in Europe, apart from the Spaniards and the Albanians. Targeted multiple times by Free State censors, O'Flaherty's novels are known mainly for their intricate psychological explorations of men on the margins of society. O'Flaherty portrays in his novels in cinematic detail the violently unstable inner lives of outcasts, criminals and murderers. But perhaps more jarringly, for increasingly vocal social reformers who pitted themselves against what they viewed as indecent literature and behaviour in the Free State period, O'Flaherty's novels vibrate with an obsessive interest in Dublin's sexual and commercial underworlds, returning to the figure of the prostitute and presenting sympathetic, ambiguous, and often erotic renderings of this particular social outcast. As the prostitute was cast increasingly as an object of social control in Free State Ireland, the new state that came about in 1922, prostitute characters and red light spaces populated Irish fiction, lending subversive appeal to experimental texts such as James Joyce's Ulysses, 1922, and Samuel Beckett's 1938 novel Murphy. With his 1929 novel, The House of Gold, O'Flaherty, one of the most prolific writers of the Free State, earned the notable accolade of being the first author banned under the 1929 Censorship of Publications Act. And like Joyce and Beckett, O'Flaherty's writing anticipated and even courted censorship, deploying prostitution as a subject which both shocked the sensibilities of a more visibly Catholic post-independence political establishment and piqued the interest of a reading public hungry for lurid details. But prostitution as a highly contested practice, which seemed to highlight interrelated anxieties about gender, desire, commerce, and modernity in the newly independent state, also became a weapon in O'Flaherty's critique of the failures of political authority in post-independence Ireland. O'Flaherty's 1925 novel, The Informer, presents a satirical take on dominant social purist understandings of the prostitute as a specimen of failed womanhood and an agent of national decline. The character, Katie Fox, a street-based prostitute, is an emblem of female degeneracy, her degraded physical and moral status, heightening the sense of despondency which characterises the savage urban environment navigated by the protagonist, Gip O'Nolan. Her status as a social outcast is marked by her physical deformity. She attempts to conceal her social and physical difference using makeup, a signifier of modern female degeneracy which was repeatedly targeted in Irish Catholic sermons and religious pamphlets throughout the 1920s. One of the isolated and impoverished Gippo's few remaining friends, Katie is described as a woman of the slums. O'Flaherty's prose here knowingly mimics the rhetoric of anti-prostitution reformers in its emphasis on the prostitute's moral weakness, her emotional irrationality, and physical pathology. After that, her first plunge from the straight path of the tremendous respectability and conservatism of the slum woman, she was led by excess of feeling into one pitfall after another. Finally, she passed out of the ranks of respectability altogether. Now she had become an abandoned woman, known as such even among the prostitutes of the brothel quarter, a drug fiend, a slattern, an irresponsible creature. Traces of her young beauty still remained in the deep blue eyes that were melancholy and tired and twitched at the edges, in her long, lean figure now grown emaciated, in her black hair that strayed carelessly about her face from beneath the rim of her ragged hat. But that mouth, that telltale register of vice, had completely lost the sumptuous but delicate curves of innocent girlhood and blossoming maturity. The lips hung down at the sides. They were swollen in the middle. Their colour had died out and had been renewed with loud vulgarity by cheap paint. And so my reading of this is that O'Flaherty is ironically appropriating the discourse of Catholic conservatism and moral panic. In The Informer, an exploration of betrayal in the aftermath of the Civil War, the urban prostitute is part of the same scenery as crumbling, formerly grand Georgian mansions turned tenements. She evokes a profoundly alienating physical and moral environment. She is also, though, a symbol of potent and exciting economic and cultural modernity, an erotic spectacle which shocks the paralysed post-Joycean Irish body into life. In the 1926 novel Mr. Gilhooly, which rivaled Ulysses in its notoriety in Ireland, the prostitute is introduced as a signifier of both economic desperation and modern urban leisure and entertainment. The character Larry Gilhooly's excitement at the scene of, quote, courtesans swaying their full haunches, unquote, on Grafton Street, for example, provokes their comparison to peasants who have come to the fair to sell something. Here, the prostitute is depicted as a vendor, a member of the working class who is part of the urban economy. And one of the things O'Flaherty's work illustrates so well is how connected commercialized sex is to the rest of city life. The scene of parading courtesans Mr. Gilhooly witnesses sparks an anonymous erotic encounter with a woman in the modern space of the cinema, causing, quote, a violent shock which sent a shiver down his spine, unquote. The novel, however, extends beyond the literary trope of the prostitute as a symbol or metaphor for modernity. Indeed, one of the novel's most developed characters, Nellie, is a woman who exchanges sex and companionship for economic security, provocatively complicating the boundaries between wife and prostitute. By the early 20th century, the prostitute had long symbolized sin and degradation in urban society. In the writing of Charles Baudelaire, the prostitute functioned, as Rita Felsky has noted, as the ultimate symbol for the commodification of eros, and even a symbol of money itself. Baudelaire's expression, qu'est-ce que la prostitution, illustrates a 19th century preoccupation with prostitution as a metaphor for the relationship between art and commerce, and remains perhaps the most famous literary assertion of a sexualized convergence between art and the market. The early 20th century artistic movement, now categorized as modernism, coincided with a moment when, across the British Empire and former colonial territories, a new discourse began increasingly to envelop the prostitute, one which constructed her largely as a victim of economic circumstance, of male perversion, or of her own moral weakness. But O'Flaherty intervenes more urgently and more politically in this complex web of images and ideologies surrounding the practice of prostitution than other contemporary Irish writers who drew the scorn of censors. A writer who straddled modernism and more popular literary forms, O'Flaherty wrote about urban prostitution prolifically and graphically at a time when Irish sexual politics were shaped increasingly by regulation. O'Flaherty's insistence on depicting not only sex, but the murky territories of sex and poverty coincided with the growth in number and influence of Free State social reform societies, and these organizations' navigation of the emerging tensions between narratives of deviance and victimhood in anti-prostitution discourse. Among the most explicit artistic engagements with Irish class relations and the politics of desire in this period, O'Flaherty's fiction is noteworthy in the way it addresses Irish and international developments in the conceptualization, public framing, and approach to prostitution as a social problem, by largely resisting the simplistic framing of the prostitute as either a victim or a predator, and disturbing the boundaries between the categories of respectable woman and prostitute, all in the midst of a post-imperial culture that was in the process of creating new public moral languages to represent collectivity. In the immediate post-independence period in Ireland, the prostitute's real and imagined body became a focal point for heightened anxieties about national and cultural decline, expressions of female sexuality, and the need to protect the virtue of Irish women in a new and precarious era of national transformation. Following the dissolution of British garrisons in Ireland, long cited in anti-colonial discourse as the primary source of sexual immorality in the country, nationalists had to contend not only with the continued existence of prostitution and its demand, but a thriving commercial sex industry, which affected the social and economic fabric of a country recently ravaged by revolutionary violence. The fact that Irish prostitution was not abolished or even curtailed significantly after the withdrawal of British soldiers presented an uncomfortable reality to the state and to social reformers. This social problem directly contested an increasingly prominent narrative of citizenship, which appealed to beliefs in inherent Irish purity and moral superiority. Appeals to step up vice enforcement, part of broader efforts to maintain civic authority in the Free State after the unstable conditions of the War of Independence and the Civil War, manifested in a fixation with the social evil of prostitution. Investigations into the state of sexual morality in the Seirstead, commissioned soon after independence, the most notable of which include the suppressed Carrigan Committee Report, 1930, appeared to reveal alarming increases in sexual crime along with spikes in rates of venereal disease and illegitimacy, contradicting the Irish Christian Brothers' 1924 declaration that purity is the national virtue of Ireland. And often at the centre of such investigations and reports, the prostitute's body was repeatedly identified as a threat to national progress. The state, the Catholic Church, and lay reform organisations or vigilance societies were collusive in this period in generating what the journalist and writer Melissa Gira-Grant calls a prostitute imaginary, the ways in which we conceptualize and make arguments about prostitution. While prolific, this imaginary was also inconsistent and plagued by ambivalence. During the first two decades of independence, the prostitute was positioned variously as a social deviant, more commonly a victim, and an agent of physical and moral decay, imagined through a collection of social reform, medical, legal, journalistic, and political discourses, all of which were mobilized towards maintaining a morally sanitized landscape. And the most famous of these measures included the Censorship of Publications Act in 1929 and the systematic closure of Dublin's brothel district, the Monto, in 1925 by vigilance organisation the Legion of Mary, a group founded in 1921 and led by Frank Duff, which exerted significant influence on the practice of prostitution in Dublin. As the research of social historians such as Maria Luddy and Susanna Reardon illustrates, the testimonies and first-hand narratives, if indeed they existed at all, of women who worked as prostitutes in the Free State period have now been largely obscured or lost. As scholars investigating the ways in which prostitution was framed, discussed, and treated as a social problem in post-independence Ireland, we must acknowledge the fact that no significant amount of first-hand prostitution narratives appear to have been produced or survived from this period. In the absence of early 20th century Irish prostitute discourse, then, scholars have limited access to the narratives of women who were and remain largely symbolic, put to use variously in nationalist, reformist, and nation-building discourses as a signifier of threatening modernity, dangerous new forms of sub- and youth culture, sexual deviance, or defiled Irish womanhood in need of rehabilitation. And this is why, for me, as someone interested in the politics of prostitution during this era of nationalist state formation, I look to O'Flaherty's works not as historical records, because they are works of fiction, but as valuable cultural documents which present an alternative to the characterization of prostitution found in government documents and reports of the Free State period. Both highly sexual and an object of medical interest, the prostitute is constructed via the statistical reports, testimonies, and recommendations of the venereal disease doctor, the prison guard, the police commissioner, and the Catholic social hygienist, revealed to us primarily through the discourses of those who wish to surveil, inspect, imprison, fine, raid, rescue, and reform her. Presented as a poor creature compelled to her trade by personal or moral weakness, a predator and temptress who created unsavory demand in Irish men, or an innocent country girl led astray, the prostitute appears in government reports on venereal disease, court records, press reporting, and the records of social workers and vice crusaders, but rarely in her own words. The disruptive power of O'Flaherty's fictional representation of prostitution was given an enduring legacy via its incorporation into visual art. And a particularly resonant image is artist Harry Clarke's 1934 stained glass window, ultimately rejected by the Irish Department of Industry and Commerce, which depicts a scene from Mr. Gilhooly. W.T. Cosgrave, president of the Executive Council, explained to Clarke that the inclusion of scenes from certain authors as representative of Irish literature and culture would give grave offence to many of our people. Clarke's window depicts a scene from the midpoint of Mr. Gilhooly, a thriller which tells the story of a restless, ageing Dublin bachelor who attempts to gain acceptance into the social world of middle-class Dublin by mimicking traditional domesticity. A forced early retiree, 49-year-old Larry Gilhooly endures a psychologically unmoored existence of absolute idleness in Dublin after years working in South America. A bored man easily distracted by the modern entertainments the gloomy city offers, Mr. Gilhooly ultimately longs for a more settled life and enters into a faux marital domestic arrangement with his companion Nellie, much to the indignation of his middle-class would-be peers. The relationship between Nellie and Gilhooly, characterised by a vast discrepancy in both age and financial security, echoes in some ways the relationship between the prostitute Katie Fox and Gip O'Nolan in the novel The Informer. Like Katie, Nellie's relationship to Mr. Gilhooly is ambivalent. She is, quote, undoubtedly not his wife, and in the same manner she could not be called his mistress, unquote. A Galway woman 20 years his junior, Nellie is not a professional prostitute. Rather, she is, like Mr. Gilhooly, a person abandoned to the brutality and anonymity of the modern city. Yet she's opportunistic and cunning in her realization that she can monetize men's interest in her. In contrast to the street-hardened appearance of the prostitutes in The Informer, when Mr. Gilhooly first meets Nellie, homeless on the streets of Dublin, she is, quote, young, slim, her features not yet hardened by age, nor by the vice which might be expected, and which Mr. Gilhooly did expect, unquote. Their relationship is sexual and transactional in nature. Nellie, who refers to Mr. Gilhooly as uncle, offers not only companionship in exchange for a home and a weekly allowance, but manages Mr. Gilhooly's domestic life, soon becoming a necessity to him. Eventually, the social mistrust and sexual attention aroused by Nellie's ambiguous status proves an insurmountable obstacle, leading Mr. Gilhooly to murder her in a possessive rage. And while O'Flaherty's writing here invokes, in some ways, the shock value of the literary trope of the murdered prostitute, as a novel, Mr. Gilhooly does more to complicate Free State characterizations of the prostitute than the informer, disturbing popular distinctions between the prostitute class and respectable women. Specifically, it is the ambiguity of their relationship and the manner in which Nellie appeals both to a paternalistic instinct and an erotic impulse in Mr. Gilhooly, which troubles neat Free State distinctions between the fallen and respectable woman. And for me, this is the disruptive and radical essence of O'Flaherty's social drama. Via the mental unravelling and ultimate descent into criminality of the character Larry Gilhooly, O'Flaherty exposes the damaging effects of slavish devotion to the pursuit of respectability in post-independence Ireland, capturing the moments at which morally upright citizens clash with Dublin's social and sexual underworld in the street, the cinema, and the brothel. The novel is deeply critical of what O'Flaherty viewed as the hypocritical aspects of bourgeois Irish society. In the scene which captured Harry Clarke's imagination, Mr. Gilhooly is transfixed by a dance performed by Nellie. At the midpoint of the novel, having been acrimoniously ejected from his lodging house on suspicion of hiring a tart, Mr. Gilhooly moves with Nellie into what his estate agent refers to as a man's flat, a respectable man's flat, and he's thrilled by the fantasy that they are man and wife. In the passage inscribed on the Clarke window, O'Flaherty describes how Mr. Gilhooly sits mesmerised as Nellie came toward him dancing, moving the folds of the veil so that they unfolded slowly as she danced. And here is the image that Harry Clarke captured, which was ultimately rejected by the Irish government, but is now in the Hugh Lane Gallery in Dublin. In this scene, considered too offensive for inclusion in the Department of Commerce's stained glass window, Nellie is a composite of the most exalted and the most demonised features of Irish womanhood. She is both chaste and precocious, enticing her spectator with partial nudity while simultaneously suggesting the purity of the Virgin Mary as, in the novel, she moves barefoot, quote, clad in white like a nun, unquote. And what perhaps disturbed W.T. Cosgrave most about this scene is its juxtaposition of images of degraded and idealised Free State femininity. Nellie can be seen as a tainted version of the Virgin Mother, not only in her eroticism, but in her commercialised sexuality. Through the character of Nellie, simultaneously evocative of purity, maternity, and economic shrewdness, O'Flaherty disrupts the traditional value judgment which perpetuates the division of the female body into two traditional female bodies, the wife and the prostitute. By writing a prostitute character who is simultaneously maternal, virginal, and acutely aware of her ability to manipulate sexual dynamics for economic gain, O'Flaherty deliberately disrupts the culturally resonant image of the Virgin Mother, a changeless icon of feminine purity. Another area in which O'Flaherty extends his representation of prostitution beyond the symbolic is in his evocation of the economic conditions which lead some women to sell sex. O'Flaherty takes pains to emphasise the limited mobility of working-class women in the social world of 1920s Dublin. For although in Mr. Gilhooly, the housekeeper Sissy is the first one to raise the alarm about the presence of a tart in Mr. Gilhooly's room at his lodging house, she herself is at the mercy of a ruthlessly gendered economy. O'Flaherty writes, Sissy had never the cunning to become a courtesan, nor indeed the wisdom. Sissy lost her job after each child was born, for no honest matron is willing to keep a fallen woman in her house, even though her son or husband may be the father of the child, or perhaps just because of that. So O'Flaherty really doesn't shy away from raising these uncomfortable issues. So largely interpreted as a protest against the Censorship of Publications Act, The Puritan is conceptually similar to Mr. Gilhooly in that both novels suggest that the obsessive pursuit of respectability and the obsession with social cleanliness in post-independence Ireland come at the expense of true compassion for the impoverished, and ultimately lead to the criminality of men and the death of women. Furthermore, both novels explore definitions of respectability, citizenship, and criminality through the topic of prostitution. The murders of prostitutes by socially marginalised men, each obsessed in their own ways with respectability, are pivotal events in both novels. The plot trajectory of The Puritan is in one way the reverse of Mr. Gilhooly. Mr. Gilhooly opens with the urban isolation of the eponymous character and ends with his strangling of his mistress/concubine/wife Nellie in bed. The Puritan opens with Dublin journalist and religious fanatic Francis Ferreter's psychologically detached stabbing of a prostitute, Teresa Burke, in her rented room at a lodging house, and ends with his unhinged confession of the murder to another prostitute in a Dublin brothel. Following a night of immersion in the supposedly immoral Dublin underworld, he sought to purify with the blood sacrifice of the murder. In Mr. Gilhooly, O'Flaherty dramatises a specific fear held by Free State social reformers and legislators, that the boundary between the respectable woman and the prostitute was permeable. Surveillance was a tactic used to discover the respectability or lack thereof of women suspected of being prostitutes in the Free State, and is still one of the primary modes through which viewers and readers come to know the prostitute in much of the media concerning commercial sex throughout the 20th and into the 21st century. Some of the Free State's most active prostitution abolitionists, including Police Commissioner William Murphy, often included detailed descriptions of violence against prostitutes in their reports and testimonies to the government. Ostensibly concerned factual descriptions in official reports reveal a voyeuristic interest in salacious detail, a veiled erotic interest appearing under the guise of concern. And the genius of The Puritan is that it illustrates that surveillance of the prostitute isn't meant to expand public knowledge of her life. It's to investigate some form of harm to the public that is believed to originate with her. The character Francis Ferreter is an extreme embodiment of the logic of both censorship and social hygiene. Perhaps a more sensationalist and less comical precursor to the sadistic moralist Dermot Trellis in Flann O'Brien's 1939 novel At Swim Two Birds. Like Ferreter, the character Trellis is intent on ridding society of its impurities, and like Ferreter, Trellis's purifying impulses are so zealous that they ultimately manifest in violence. In O'Brien's novel, the author Trellis plans to dissuade the Irish public from immorality by luring them into reading a moralizing tract that contains no less than 7 indecent assaults on young girls. The Puritan is, of course, vastly different from At Swim Two Birds in terms of its plot, its register, and the metaphysical possibilities of the fictional world it creates. Nonetheless, what O'Flaherty and O'Brien both suggest is a deep hypocrisy undergirding social reform efforts which seek to surveil and protect vulnerable women and the reading public from morally corrupting forces. The implication that Francis Ferreter is subconsciously in love with Teresa Burke suggests the presence of a form of suppressed desire driving the Free State's most aggressive social purists. While Ferreter's motives are ostensibly moral, he claims he's policing the community. He admits that he gains some pleasure from spying on Teresa. I pretended to believe that I listened in disgust or simply through a sense of duty because I belonged at that time to a vigilant society, and it was part of our duty to report cases of immorality. I really listened for personal reasons. I wanted to hear her voice because it was particularly soft and melodious, and it gave me an intense and passionate pleasure, even though I lay awake at night afterwards, hating it for the pleasure it gave me. Despite Ferreter's apparent purity, the repetition of the word naked here betrays his obsession with nudity, and here O'Flaherty reveals surveillance and social purity to be an unconvincing veil for erotic interest and ultimately misogynist violence. He forms an unusually direct critique of the most influential anti-prostitution reformers of the Free State era. Ferreter's internal monologue suggests that dominant, dehumanizing constructions of the prostitute as a deviant or a completely passive victim in need of rescue permit his objectification of her, the denial of her humanity, and ultimately her murder. It's her status as a symbol of degraded womanhood and modernity that justifies, for Ferreter, her murder. He initially rationalizes an act of violence against one woman as necessary for the moral purification of society at large. In a far more direct, explicit manner than the period's more visible modernist icons, O'Flaherty skewers both the social reformer's gaze and paternal impulses at play in society in the Puritan. As Ferreter, the anti-prostitution social reformer, reveals himself to be the pervert he had claimed others had been. O'Flaherty highlights cracks in contemporary anti-prostitution discourses centred on rescue and reform by showing the fine line between impulses to protect women and the desire to harm them. As the police detective Lavin articulates to Ferreter in The Puritan, quote, "These vigilant societies, acting on the best motives, might lead people into activities altogether, you might say, criminal and more dangerous than the activities they try to suppress," unquote. And certainly Ferreter's murder of Teresa Burke, framed by him as an act of social protection, is both more criminal and more dangerous than whatever work she performed in her rented room. The Puritan reflects a Dublin apparently sanitised in the aftermath of the Legion of Mary and the police's rescue initiatives. Rather than the regulated brothel system which operated previously, some single women renting rooms in lodging houses were now using their rooms as premises for their trade, something reformers in the 1920s feared greatly. Garda Commissioner William Murphy had gone so far as to suggest in the 1920s that any single woman renting a room alone be charged with operating a brothel. In focusing on the panic provoked by a single woman renting a room for the purposes of selling sexual services, the Puritan raises one of the most pertinent and relevant questions of the Free State, at a time when the city was popularly viewed as a threatening collusion of colonialist urban planning and morally corrupting modern entertainments. O'Flaherty drew readers' attention to the question of who gets to be in public space and why, who gets to be seen. And indeed, it's Teresa Burke's visibility, her being seen, that disturbs Ferreter the most. His last act before abandoning her corpse is to cover her exposed leg with her dressing gown. Similarly, the notorious veil dance in Mr. Gilhooly also dramatises a tension between showing and hiding the female body in the Irish popular imagination. The novel Mr. Gilhooly also illustrates the economic ramifications of brothel closure on Dublin's working class communities, showing a correlation between a vastly scaled down brothel district and an increased sense of animosity between working class communities, where commercial sex had once thrived, and the police and the middle classes, reflecting shifts in the mechanics of commercial sex and indeed the adaptability of it as an industry. O'Flaherty's novel also dramatises the negative impact of brothel closure and the criminalisation on women who work as prostitutes. In the novel, the people who live in the inner city are suspicious of the police who come to investigate Teresa's murder. They take her side, illustrating the extent to which women who worked as prostitutes were accepted in working class communities. The secrecy and covertness necessitated by Teresa Burke's sale of sex from a private room in a lodging house, rather than in the environment of a brothel under the watchful eye of a madam and surrounded by other girls, for example, results in a kind of isolation which makes her ironically more vulnerable to the violent impulses of a deranged man like Ferreter. In daring defiance of contemporary social reform discourses, then the novel not only suggests that Puritans are the true perverts, but that the cleansing of inner city Dublin through the systemic closure of its brothel district has actually made women more, not less, vulnerable to violence. And this is just a photograph of the manto in the early 1920s. As an economically and socially marginalised figure, particularly so in the context of a moral milieu such as the Irish Free State, which valorised chaste and maternal images of womanhood, the prostitute offered a way to raise questions in fiction about the stratification of the Irish city and society, questions which seemed to the socialist O'Flaherty to have been sidelined in the nation-building rhetoric of the post-independence period. While the importance of socialism to O'Flaherty is abundantly clear in his fiction, the related subversiveness of the sexual politics of O'Flaherty's writing remains more obscured, in part because of the contemporary and enduring reputations of writers like Joyce and Beckett as the primary agent provocateur of the Free State, whose daring material provoked censors. And also, I think, in part because of O'Flaherty's formal accessibility relative to these writers. But O'Flaherty's approach to the fictional representation of prostitution is more radical, I argue, than his modernist precursors and contemporaries, not least because of the intense state and civic focus on prostitution as a social problem and its status as a focal point for wider anxieties about Irish moral identity in the new Free State. O'Flaherty's graphic and probing apprehension of this web of desire, commerce, gender, and urban life is startlingly modern. O'Flaherty's representative approach to prostitution is subversive in several ways. The decision to include prostitute characters and scenes describing commercial sex in the context of literary censorship in the Irish Free State is, first of all, flagrantly provocative. Secondly, O'Flaherty's descriptions of prostitutes transcend an earlier Irish and European literary tradition whereby the prostitute is primarily symbolic, an invisible woman onto whom desires, fears, and fantasies are projected. Nellie in Mr. Gilhooly, for example, is one of the most developed characters in the novel, not merely a symbol, but a character with a psychology as complex as the main characters. A large part of the radicalism in O'Flaherty's approach to the representation of commercial sex lies also in his insistence upon criminal as an ambiguous identity. Through O'Flaherty's sensationalist urban thrillers, the prostitute is more often than not presented as a worker motivated by complex factors, a person with agency competing for survival, while the social reformer, her rescuer, is an embodiment of modern criminality. One of the most enduring and socially radical facets of O'Flaherty's fiction writing, rarely considered within literary studies to be as transgressive as the writing of modernist contemporaries, is its revelation of the social mechanisms by which the prostitute is rendered invisible. O'Flaherty's novels are valuable not only as cultural artifacts which present some of the most detailed and subversive literary representations of prostitution in the early years of Irish independence, but as evidence of the varied nature of the sexual politics of Irish literature, modernist, popular, and realist, at this transitional moment in Irish cultural and political history. O'Flaherty's representation of prostitutes, radical for its time, illustrates Irish modernism's role and Irish literature's role in constructing alternative narratives of citizenship at a time when Irish writers were characterised in government discourses more often as enemies of the state than as architects of post-independence identity. Thank you very much, and I'd be delighted to answer any questions you have.
I think you've given us a fantastic insight into
Thank
the work
you.
of Liam O'Flaherty as a really very important and radical writer,
Yes.
and which is not recognised in literary works at all.
No.
So it is really fascinating. And
Thank you.
it's also fascinating to hear so much about the mores of the Irish Free State civilization.
Yeah.